The next job is to prepare the nuts and bolts for the sump plate itself. Now, most of these washers will probably have dropped off while you were doing it, but they are crush washers, and you get new ones with the new gasket kit, so it's just a case of removing those and then cleaning up the threads. And it is really important that these are fantastically clean. The chances are there will be road grime and crud up around the sump plate itself. And the reason why this is so important, they are very fine threads. If you were to have a slightly blocked thread on there, you could wreck the engine case and then never ever get rid of the oil leaks. Okay, time to prepare the gaskets now, and it's a very straightforward thing. Make sure you leave your crush washers in there for the time being. These are paper cardboard gaskets, and it's just a case of smearing some bog-standard grease on there and generously coating them both sides on both of them, and then I generally just lay them straight back down on top of the plastic bag that they came in. But it is important, especially if it's a windy day, you're out on the drive or something like that, just bear in mind that they're going to be super gluey now, and we don't want any grit at all on here, or else you're going to have a permanently leaking gasket. So once you've got those ready and you've got your strainer ready, we can go underneath and start reassembling everything. Well, one thing I always like to do is actually scratch with a screwdriver the date of the oil change in there, and unsurprisingly this sump hasn't ever had an oil change on here. No, it's just something some mechanics do, and it's something that I like to do. Okay, before we actually refit the filter and the sump plate, what we need to do is make sure that this sealing surface is absolutely clean, free of any grit, and most importantly, any stuck on old gaskets, and there are just a couple here. So a small thin bladed screwdriver, really gently, you don't want to go digging into that surface, and you can just pull off anything else that's in there. And if some kindly soul has filled this area up with silicone sealer in the past, you may need some solvent on there. So just make sure it's really nice and smooth and level. One quick wipe over, and then we can start reassembling everything. So remember, we've greased all the way round both sides, and first off we can put up the paper gasket to seal against the case. Well, it is very obvious which way up this oil filter the strainer goes in place. You can see there it's got the mesh, and this is the most important piece, and that's going to push up over your oil filter pickup. So we can just put that up into place now. And be nice and gentle when you're pushing it in. You may find there's a bit of resistance. It does want to be quite a good seal on there anyway. But depending on how many threaded parts you've got coming down, how many studs are left in the case, and they do vary from model to model and depending on what engine work has been done. Just be nice and gentle. Right, we've got that up in place. Then we want the other paper gasket. Again, that's covered in grease both sides. And then finally, your sump plate itself. Like I suggested earlier on, you're probably best off buying a replacement one with the drain plug in it. But this one we're going to put back as per original, and the next person who does this job can have the same fun I did. Right, these can be a bit of a fiddle, so use a screwdriver, be very careful of the threads. And what we're looking to do is to actually line up the hole in the top gasket, the filter, the strainer if you like, and the bottom one, of course, the sump plate itself. And we're going to very gently and very patiently just feed this in finger tight, and then do all the others finger tight, and then we'll go round in a row and gradually torque it up. I thought, well, when you're actually doing up these sump bolts, what I like to do is just partially tighten up any of the nuts on the studs that were in there, and then very gently go round in turn and bring these up. And it's one of those ones that they're only a light torque setting on there, check with your manual as ever. But please do not over tighten any of these, because if you strip the threads out, you're going to end up in all sorts of problems, and you're going to need to seek some specialist advice and possibly have a thread insert put in. So be gentle and you won't have that problem. While you're changing the oil, it's easy to get distracted and you might have a few problems along the way. So what I always like to do myself is do a reminder, a bit of rag through the ignition key, wrap the seatbelt around the steering wheel, anything to remind you that there's no oil in the engine, just in case you come back to it, fire the engine up and wreck the engine. There's usually about 2.5 litres of oil in your Volkswagen engine. Now what I like to do is put about 1.5 litres in while the vehicle's still jacked up. That way we can make sure that there are no leaks around the sump itself. But it's really important to not do that final topping up until you've let the vehicle down onto the floor, let the oil settle. It's very important you don't overfill the engine, because if you do that and the crankcase pressure builds up, you could blow some seals and that leads to all sorts of problems. So the first thing to do is to fill up a suitable jug to get the oil in, and then prepare the engine, move a few hoses so that we've got easy access. Well, now we've filled up with our first litre, we can just gain some access so that we're not spilling the oil everywhere. Part of the reason we're using one of these dispensers with a flexible spout is so that it's easier to do. So just move the hose out of the way and swing that one round. And one point to remember, and I'm just wondering with this engine whether we're going to see it. Oh yes. Now inside here we have what's referred to as mayonnaise. This is nothing to be alarmed about. Generally that's as a result of a vehicle that doesn't do many miles or only does short local journeys. So we'll give that a good clean up, and it's always as well to give your car a good run out every now and again. And you'll probably also find that there's some mayonnaise in here. And again, I'll just use a non-linting rag or a bit of paper that you know won't fall apart. Just give that a clean out, then we can start pouring the oil in. So we're ready to pour. Remember, we're just going to put 1.5 litres in, make sure that sump's all good, and then we'll put the car back on the floor. Now, if it's a really cold day, you might want to just stand your oil can in a bucket of warm water. Otherwise, you'll be here for absolutely ages pouring this in. And I always like to have a bit of paper ready, or a rag, just in case you get any spillages. So remember, at this stage, we're not looking to fill the engine up. We'll just give the dipstick a quick wipe down, and just anywhere above the bottom mark will be fine at this stage. And there we are, just below the bottom mark. That's good enough for me. I can see the clean oil's gone in, and what a relief it is to see proper clean oil in there after that nasty sludge this had. Once you've got your vehicle back down onto the ground, it's important to let the engine oil settle in there. We do not want to overfill this machine, because otherwise we'll be blowing the gaskets out. So you might want to have a tidy up at the workshop, go and have a cup of tea, whatever. Give it a good 10 minutes and come back, and then dip the oil again. And already I can see that it has come up the dipstick, as expected, once the engine was on the level. And at this point, it's just a case of being patient, putting some more oil in, and making sure you don't overfill it. So don't get too keen, just a few glugs at a time, and double check it. Once you've done this job a few times, you'll get far more used to it. But if it is your first time, then do please take your time. Otherwise, you'll blow those gaskets and cause yourself no end of grief. Okay, at this point we can see it's just a little way down. I guess it's about 6 or 7 mil down from the top mark. Now we can put a tiny bit more in there, because once we've fired the engine up, the oil galleries will fill up and we'll need a little more in there. But remember, if it's gone over this top mark, I'm afraid you're going to have to let some out from the bottom. So a little bit at a time, don't overfill it. Right, so we'll put the hoses and, most importantly, the cap back on. Now, important thing to remember here, engine bearings need oil. Now, there are a couple of things that I could recommend. Certainly when you go to fire the engine up, don't push the throttle down. You don't want that engine to instantly start. And what you might actually want to do is disconnect the positive from the coil, the ignition switch side if you like, and then crank the engine over a few times until the oil pressure light goes out, then reconnect it, then you can fire it up. That way there's full oil pressure in there, you're not going to cause any damage to the engine. And then once you run the engine for a few minutes, let it settle for another 10 minutes, check the dipstick one final time, make sure it's just under or on that top line, never above it, and that's it, job done. So a little bit fiddly the first time you do the job, otherwise dead straightforward, and remember, about every 3,000 to 4,000 miles.